This careful omission on George's part, whether it's inadvertent or not, does contribute to noble savage racism. Hello my friends of the Psychedelic Renaissance, it's Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, and this is Academic Abstractions and the Limitations for Understanding Indigenous Medical Frameworks. So what is an academic abstraction? Just to make sure we're on the same page, an academic abstraction is when an academic removes all the complexities of an issue to make it easier to digest for both themselves and others. It's more activist rhetoric than it is serious scholarship. In her 2019 article, The Psychedelic Renaissance and the Limitations of a White-Dominant Medical Framework, Chacruna Institute affiliate Jamila R. George presents a series of academic abstractions that, from a distance, sound well-grounded, but get harder to maintain the closer we get to the issues discussed. I contend that it is these kinds of academic abstractions that prove to be hurdles in our pursuit of truth within the psychedelic renaissance. Since we live in the age of the call-out, I'd like to say right from the outset that that's not what I intend here. I don't know George personally, I'm sure she's lovely and sincere. Instead, I'd like to use this video to highlight an issue that I'm seeing become more and more prominent in psychedelic research spaces. And it's an issue I've addressed before. I suppose I intend to use this video to show just how pervasive it all is. That is, the way authors with an activist bent will ignore or omit details to force a perspective that is not actually accurate to the historical nuances and reality. I chose a single sentence to demonstrate this point, namely, so long as the words are on message,
the message,
meaning they support a culturally leftist perspective, then the veracity of the claim is somewhat flexible. As a lifelong liberal, I'm getting very uncomfortable with all of this. I mean, this is my team here. Before we get started, if you're into this kind of content, please give this video a like and a share, subscribe to the channel, and hit that little bell icon so that you're notified every time I post a new video. Also, it'd be great to see you on Instagram. Find me at Psychedelic Historian. With that out of the way, let's get into some trouble. The sentence I question reads as follows. Before the Europeans' arrival, indigenous people in the Americas maintained their own holistic system of care consisting of spiritual practices, plant-based medicines, and community involvement. Almost everything about that sentence is missing key data because it is more an academic abstraction than it is a serious attempt to understand the complexities of First Nations psychedelia. For starters, and let me just say real quick, I know this cuts against everything we've been instructed to believe, but most First Nations peoples did not use plant medicines, but instead relied on other techniques like blowing away or waving away a disease or tracking the flight of birds. This latter technique was used by the Cherokees who believed that birds brought diseases. And that's not to come down on the Cherokee. I mean, Europeans believed that diseases were brought upon by witches, so there was plenty of ignorance to go around in those days. Let's stay with the Cherokee for a moment. While Cherokee healers did take the time to gather medicinal roots, herbs, and bark which enter into the prescription, none of them were actually given to the patient. Instead, they were put into a bundle and thrown in a body of water. If the bundle sank, the healer believed the operation would fail. If the bundle floated, they believed the operation would be a success. Now, this is not to say that all indigenous peoples were lacking in medical knowledge. I mean, far from it. Certain communities, like the Coalticans, were leagues ahead of Europeans when it came to things like cauterizing wounds. I know it's hard to believe, but most First Nations peoples in what we would today call the United States and Canada, they didn't use plant medicines at all. And there's a reason for that. Many of these communities were nomadic, so they didn't have the luxury of getting acquainted with the local flora and fauna. It's easy for us today who use plant medicines to imagine that all First Nations peoples use them as well. This is another concern in psychedelia, the inadvertent rewriting of people from the past into our likeness and image. Very colonizer mindset. Moving further through this abstraction, we might note that there was never anything like a holistic system of care among First Nations peoples. The majority of those groups had different languages, different cultures, different cosmologies, and were constantly at war with each other. Oddly, George recognizes this when she writes, "Although specific rituals, practices, and beliefs vary considerably across the aforementioned indigenous groups, there are some notable similarities." Only she fails to list even a single similarity. Probably because there was nothing holistic about any of it. While the Comanche used peyote for its visionary aspects in warfare, they believed that it helped them see an advancing enemy. The Delaware believed that having peyote visions was a clear sign that you did not belong in the ceremony. For the Comanche, peyote visions were all the rage. For the Delaware, peyote visions were to be avoided. Christianity was also a hot topic among these communities, with some groups embracing it and others rejecting it. How that translates to a holistic system of care among all of these First Nations communities is anyone's guess. In fact, it might surprise George to learn that the only real similarity that cut across, the majority of these groups, was the near total exclusion of women from participation in the ceremonies. The overwhelming majority of First Nations peoples did not use psychedelics in healing. Sure, some did, no doubt about that. In fact, my good buddy Petey Newman has a book coming out, I think it's March 2025, that examines the entheogenic rites of different communities living along the Mississippi Valley. But what I'm trying to say is, different groups some of them did use plant medicines, but it was very rare and they were few and far in between. Most of the inhabitants of the Americas, the people living outside the great civilizations of the Aztec, Maya, and Inca, had no knowledge of psychedelic compounds whatsoever, no matter how much we romanticize history otherwise. Even ayahuasca, which is often billed as an ancient indigenous medicine, is closer to about only 300 years old based on linguistic and anthropological evidence. The spread of peyote outside this tiny area of northern Mexico and modern-day southern Texas only occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Before that, one would be hard-pressed to find many First Nations peoples who were familiar with peyote or even mushrooms for that matter. Medicines like peyote spread in the late 19th century due to innovations brought to this continent by the West, like horseback riding, modern roads, and a ceasing of the rampant tribal feuding that used to erupt all across the plains and southwest. Peyote stayed in a small isolated region for so long because long-distance travel was fraught with all kinds of dangers. People stealing, rape, and child murder were all de rigueur among First Nations peoples. We're not supposed to know that. And putting aside that many First Nations peoples didn't know anything about psychedelia, what about those groups that did know about psychedelia but rejected it? That never gets mentioned either. The trick, as George demonstrates through omission, is to create an abstraction that simply sees all First Nations peoples of approving of psychedelia. But that wasn't the case at all. As I pointed out in my Protesting Rick Doblin video, there were First Nations peoples who were actively against the use of peyote. For those interested, I'll link that video below. But for now, I'll ask the same question here. Are we to honor the pro-psychedelic indigenous voice or the anti-psychedelic indigenous voice? George never tells us. And of spiritual practices with plant medicines? Well, George does have a point here. Some First Nations peoples did use psychedelics in healing, as I mentioned a moment ago, my buddy has a book coming out on the topic. But that is not the only way psychedelics were used. Plant medicines were also used among First Nations peoples for war, cannibalism, human sacrifice, and recreation. This careful omission on George's part, whether it's inadvertent or not, does contribute to noble savage racism. And what of community healing? Well, that really depends. If you were a man, you could participate in the ceremony. We today consider community to mean inclusive, but that's due to Western liberal values that did not exist among First Nations peoples. Reading the journal of Spanish conquistador Alvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, one is struck by the number of times he mentions a plant medicine ceremony and notes that women were not allowed to participate. Among the Aztecs, even being a man was no guarantee of participation in the ceremony. Aztec mushroom ceremonies were pompous, self-aggrandizing, ghastly sacrificial events that were reserved only for elite men. All women and men of lower rank? Well, they could go pound sand. Let's round out this critique by scoring George on that one sentence. And by the way, I could actually, what I just did in this video, I could do for almost every sentence in her article. Yes, some First Nations peoples absolutely used plant medicines, but it was only a small minority that did. The overwhelming majority of First Nations peoples did not use plant medicines and instead relied on techniques like blowing on a person or tracking the flight of birds or throwing bundles of medicinal herbs into a river. And no, community involvement was anything but inclusive to the broader community. Somehow, this all passed the peer review board at the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. If our only academic outlet is so encumbered by these obvious biases, and I mean, let's just be real here, subpar scholarship, how is that going to work for legitimizing psychedelic medicines? If even a true believer such as myself can pick apart these claims with very little effort, what will happen when a hostile reviewer of all things psychedelic get their hands on these easily dismantled academic abstractions? Well, my friends, that's all I have for you this time, and I'd love to thank you for stopping by. Please like, share, leave a comment, tell me how I can improve this channel, and let's meet up on Instagram. And until we meet again, I'm Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, reminding you that you free your mind by using your brain. Peace.